Eleanor Whitfield signed the papers on a hospital bed, her wrist still in a brace, and did not understand what she had signed until the locksmith came to change the door she had walked through for 51 years. Her children called it help. They called it what was best for a woman of 76 who had fallen once and might fall again. And they said it fast, the way people say things they have already decided not to take back. But the house was never the whole of what her mother left her. 5 acres of orchard sat apart from the deed, filed under a name so old the county clerk had to blow the dust from the binder to find it. Somewhere past a gravel lane no one had graded in years, past a fence sagging under 40 winters, one tree stood pruned and green among the wild ones, tended by hands that were not Eleanor's and had no reason to be. What waited for her at the end of that lane was not a ruin. It was a debt the whole town had been quietly paying for decades, and she was about to learn her mother's name for it. But to understand what waited at the end of that lane, it helped to go back to the beginning, long before hospital beds and locksmiths, back to a spring morning in 1944. Ruth Anders was 22 years old that year, with a husband overseas and a baby on her hip, and she bought 5 acres of scrubland off County Road 12 with money saved $1 at a time from selling eggs. The land agent told her she was foolish. Orchard trees took 7 years to bear real fruit, he said, and a woman alone had no business planting something she might not live to pick. Ruth signed the paper anyway, in a hand steady enough to embarrass him, and walked home carrying her daughter and a bundle of bare root saplings wrapped in wet burlap. She planted 12 trees that first week, 6 Golden Delicious, 4 Wine Sap, and 2 Rome Beauty, set in rows she measured with a length of clothesline knotted every 30 feet. The baby, Eleanor, slept in a bushel basket at the edge of the field while her mother worked, and when Eleanor was old enough to walk, she carried water to the young trees in a tin pail that left a red welt across her palm by August. Ruth never apologized for the work. She handed her daughter a smaller pail instead, one that fit a 6-year-old's grip, and told her that a tree only knew if you showed up or you didn't. The husband came home from the war in 1945, missing 2 fingers on his left hand and most of his patience for farming. He worked the main house and the 80 acres around it, acres that would one day be sold from a hospital bed. But he never once set foot in Ruth's orchard. It was hers, bought before the marriage with her own egg money, and by some agreement, neither of them spoke aloud. It stayed hers. He called it Ruth's foolishness, not unkindly, the way a man names a thing he doesn't understand and has decided not to fight. Ruth let him call it whatever he wanted, and kept the orchard's deed folded inside a coffee tin on the top shelf of the pantry, separate from every other paper in the house. Eleanor grew up between 2 kinds of ground. There was the main farm, loud with cattle and her father's moods, and there was the orchard, quiet except for bees and her mother's low humming. By the time Eleanor was 10, she could tell a fire blight canker from a healthy limb, and by 12, she knew how to graft a wine sap bud onto Rome Beauty rootstock with a knife her mother kept wrapped in oilcloth. Ruth taught her the way she taught everything, without much speech, handing over the knife, making one cut to show the angle, then stepping back to let her daughter ruin 3 or 4 grafts before one finally took. In the fall of 1952, the orchard bore its first real crop, 11 bushels off trees that had once been sticks in burlap. Ruth sold most of it at the Marrow Falls feed store for 9 cents a pound and used the money to buy Eleanor her first pair of leather work gloves, a size too big so she'd grow into them. Eleanor wore those gloves for 6 years. She wore them the day she left for a teaching job 2 counties over at 19, and she wore them again, worn soft as cloth by then, the day she came home 11 years later for her mother's funeral. The gloves outlasted a great many things in that family, though nobody thought to remark on it at the time. Ruth Anders died in March of 1988, 71 years old, found sitting upright in a kitchen chair with a grafting knife still resting in her lap, and a half-finished letter on the table in front of her. The letter was addressed to no one Eleanor recognized, and she folded it into the coffee tin without reading past the first line, telling herself there would be time later. There was never time later. Eleanor was 38 that spring, married to a good, quiet man named Harold Whitfield, raising 3 children of her own, and grief left no room for old letters. She locked the coffee tin inside a cedar chest at the main farmhouse and did not open it again for 38 years. Harold Whitfield ran the main farm after that, and ran it well, but he had no more patience for orchards than his father-in-law had, and the 5 acres off County Road 12 slipped slowly out of the family's daily life. Eleanor visited twice a year at first, then once, then only when the taxes came due and needed paying. The trees kept bearing regardless of who noticed or didn't. Nobody pruned them properly after 1991, and nobody sprayed for canker after that either. The rows Ruth had once measured with a clothesline grew tangled with wild grape and multiflora rose, until the orchard looked, to anyone driving past on County Road 12, like nothing more than an abandoned scrap of ground behind a rusted gate. Eleanor raised her 3 children in the house her father had built, and she told them almost nothing about the coffee tin, or the orchard, or the letter she had never finished reading. There seemed no reason to. Her son Gary moved to Columbus for insurance work. Her daughter Pam settled 2 towns over and stopped visiting except at Christmas, and her youngest, Denise, stayed closest but grew busiest. A woman with 3 jobs and no patience left over for stories about a grandmother who died before she was born. Harold passed in 2009, and Eleanor kept the farmhouse alone for 15 years after that. She grew older in the same rooms her mother had once left every morning to walk a knotted clothesline through bare dirt. By the time Eleanor turned 76, in the winter before everything changed, the orchard had not been mentioned in the family for the better part of 2 decades. The coffee tin sat where it always had, inside a cedar chest, inside a farmhouse that still smelled faintly of wood smoke and old apples, though nobody living there anymore could say exactly why. Eleanor herself had half forgotten the tin was there. She thought of the orchard sometimes in autumn, when the light slanted a certain way through the kitchen window, and she thought of her mother's hands, cracked and strong, guiding a small knife through green wood. She did not think of the deed, and she did not think of the letter, and she had no reason yet to believe that a fall on an icy porch step in January would put both of those things back into her hands, whether she was ready for them or not. The fall happened on the 9th of January, on the 3rd step of the back porch, where ice had formed under a skim of fresh snow that hid it from view. Eleanor went down hard on her left hip and lay there for 11 minutes before a neighbor's dog started barking loud enough to bring someone. By the time an ambulance reached Marrow Falls Memorial, she had a fractured hip and a mild concussion, and the doctor told Gary, who arrived first, that his mother would need 6 to 8 weeks of supervised recovery before anyone could say how well she'd walk again. Gary called Pam from the hallway outside her room. Pam called Denise before the day was through, and within a week the 3 of them had agreed, without asking Eleanor a single question, that the farmhouse was too much house for a woman who might not walk unassisted again. By the time Eleanor was alert enough to understand what had been decided, the decision had already moved past the point where her opinion mattered to anyone but herself. She said little about it in the hospital bed, because there was little room left in her to say anything at all, between the pain medication and the strange floating grief of hearing her own life rearranged in a hallway she couldn't see. She signed what she was told needed signing, in a hand that shook more than her mother's ever had, and she did not fully understand, until 3 weeks later, what all of it had added up to. By then, the locks on the house she had lived in for 51 years belonged to someone else, and Eleanor Whitfield was a woman with a walker, a small rented room above the Marrow Falls Pharmacy, and a great deal of time to sit with what had been taken from her. She did not sit with it quietly for long. On a Tuesday afternoon in late February, with her hip healed enough to manage a cane, Eleanor asked her home health aide, a patient young woman named Carla, to drive her to the county recorder's office instead of to physical therapy. Carla didn't ask why. She parked the car on the square across from the courthouse, helped Eleanor up the granite steps one at a time, and waited on a bench in the hallway while Eleanor pushed through a door marked Deeds and Records in gold letters half worn away. Eleanor had come, she told the clerk, to understand exactly what her family had owned and what they hadn't, because nobody had bothered to explain that to her before signing it away. The clerk, a heavy-set man named Fenton Rooks who had worked the recorder's office for 26 years, pulled the file for Whitfield, Harold, and Eleanor, parcel number 4471, and set it on the counter between them. It was a thin file. It listed the 80 acres and farmhouse, sold on February the 11th for $61,400, a figure Eleanor had not been told until that moment, and one that made her set her cane down harder than she meant to. Fenton offered her a chair, and she took it, and for a while neither of them said anything, while Eleanor read the sale document twice, looking for her own signature and finding it, small and unsteady, at the bottom of the third page. What struck Eleanor first was not the money. It was a single line near the bottom of the legal description listing the parcel's boundaries that mentioned an adjoining 5-acre tract excluded from the sale. She asked Fenton what that meant, and he turned to his computer, typed for a moment, and told her the excluded parcel was recorded separately under a different name entirely. Not Whitfield. Not even Anders at first glance, because the original filing used her mother's maiden name in a way the modern system barely recognized. Eleanor asked him to pull that file too, and Fenton disappeared into the back room for the better part of 20 minutes, returning with a folder so old its edges had gone soft as cloth. The deed inside was dated April the 4th, 1944, and it named Ruth Evelyn Anders as sole owner of 5 acres described only as an orchard tract off County Road 12, purchased for $211 from a man named Silas Meeker. There was no mention of a husband, no joint ownership clause, nothing to tie the parcel to the main farm at all. Eleanor sat with the paper in her lap for a long moment, running her thumb along the crease where it had been folded the same way for 8 decades, and understood, slowly, that this piece of ground had never belonged to the farm her children sold. It had belonged only to her mother, and now, by simple and undisturbed inheritance, it belonged only to her. Fenton confirmed it for her twice, patiently, the way a man explains something he suspects the listener already believes but needs to hear aloud. The tax record showed the parcel current through the previous year, paid in a modest sum by the estate without anyone in the family quite noticing what they were paying for. Nobody had transferred it, sold it, or folded it into any later document, because nobody had remembered it was separate in the first place. It had simply sat there for 38 years since Ruth's death, quietly belonging to whoever came next in the line, waiting the way land waits, without complaint and without need of being noticed. Eleanor asked for a copy of both deeds, and Fenton made them without charge, sliding the papers into a manila envelope and telling her, in the plain way of a man who had seen a great many surprised faces across that counter, that she ought to go out and look at the place before she decided what any of it meant. She thanked him, gathered her cane, and walked back out into the cold with the envelope pressed flat against her coat. Carla was still waiting on the bench, and she stood when she saw Eleanor's face, asking if everything was all right. Eleanor said she wasn't certain yet, and asked instead if Carla knew where County Road 12 ran, because there was somewhere she needed to see before the light went. They did not make it there that afternoon. Carla had another client waiting by 4 o'clock, and Eleanor's hip ached in a way that told her the day had already asked more of it than it wanted to give. But she sat in the passenger seat on the drive back to the pharmacy apartment with the envelope open on her lap, reading the 1944 deed for the 4th or 5th time, feeling something she hadn't expected to feel in the weeks since the fall. It wasn't relief exactly, and it wasn't anger at what her children had done, though both of those things sat close underneath it. It was closer to the feeling of finding a door in a wall she had believed, for 38 years, was solid all the way through. 3 days passed before Eleanor found someone willing to drive her out to County Road 12, because Carla's schedule ran full through the week and Eleanor no longer owned a vehicle of her own to make the trip herself. It was Denise in the end who agreed to take her, though not without a sigh over the phone that Eleanor chose not to comment on. Denise arrived at the pharmacy apartment on a Saturday morning in an old Chevrolet Silverado, still in her work boots from a shift the night before, and she looked at the manila envelope in her mother's lap the way a person looks at something they suspect will cost them more time than they have to give. The drive out of Marrow Falls took them first along Route 9, a 2-lane state road with a fresh yellow stripe down the middle and a gas station every few miles selling coffee for $1.09. Eleanor watched the town thin out through the passenger window, the hardware store and the Baptist church giving way to fields still brown with winter, and she said little, holding the envelope flat against her knees as though it might slide away if she loosened her grip. Denise asked twice what exactly they were driving out to see, and both times Eleanor answered only that she'd know it when the pavement ran out. It was not an answer meant to frustrate her daughter, though it did, and Eleanor understood that too and let it sit between them without apology. The pavement ran out 8 miles past the Route 9 turnoff, where County Road 12 dropped from asphalt to hard-packed gravel without any sign announcing the change. The truck's tires found the new surface with a shift in sound, a low, steady crunch that replaced the smooth hiss of the highway, and Denise slowed instinctively the way anyone does when a road stops trusting itself to stay flat. Fence posts leaned at odd angles along both sides, strung with wire gone slack and rusted the color of dried blood. And here and there, a mailbox stood alone at the end of a driveway that led to nothing Eleanor could see from the truck. The land here had the look of a place people passed through on their way to somewhere else, not a place anyone chose to stop. 2 more miles brought them to a second narrowing, where the gravel gave way to a rutted dirt lane barely wide enough for the truck's mirrors to clear the brush on either side. Denise eased the Silverado forward at a crawl, wincing at each scrape of branch against paint, and asked once more, with real irritation this time, whether her mother was certain this was the right road. Eleanor checked the deed against a faded county map Fenton had photocopied for her, tracing the parcel boundary with one finger, and said that it was. The lane bent twice through a stand of bare sycamores, and on the far side of the second bend, a rusted gate came into view, chained shut but sagging enough on its hinges that it no longer needed the chain to keep it closed. Denise parked short of the gate and Eleanor climbed down from the cab slowly, her cane finding uncertain purchase in the frozen mud. And for a moment she simply stood there looking at what had been her mother's land for 80 years and her own, unknowingly, for 38 of them. The 5 acres beyond the gate looked at first glance exactly like every other neglected corner of County Road 12. Multiflora rose had swallowed whole sections of fence line, and wild grape hung in heavy curtains from limbs that should have been bare and pruned for winter. A collapsed toolshed roof showed gray and sagging through a gap in the brush, and the rows Ruth had once measured with a knotted clothesline had long since dissolved into a tangle no eye could follow. But as Eleanor's gaze moved slowly across the wreck of the place, it caught on something that did not belong, the way a single wrong note catches the ear in an otherwise familiar song. Near the center of the orchard, past a dozen trees choked with vine and dead wood, one tree stood apart. Its limbs had been cut back hard and clean, the pruning cuts pale and recent against darker bark, shaped into the open, spreading form that told anyone who understood orchards that a hand with real knowledge had worked that tree within the last year, maybe within the last season. Eleanor had made that exact cut herself 1,000 times as a girl, her mother's knife guiding her wrist, and she knew the shape of deliberate care when she saw it standing alone in a field of ruin. She did not say anything to Denise at first, because there was nothing yet she trusted herself to explain. She walked instead toward the gate, Kane sinking slightly with each step, and studied the chain holding it shut. It was newer than the gate itself, a galvanized loop with a padlock still bright enough to catch the weak February sun, and that too did not belong to a property nobody had visited in 20 years. Denise came up beside her, arms crossed against the cold, and finally asked what her mother kept staring at so hard. Eleanor pointed with her cane at the single pruned tree standing green-limbed among the tangle, and said only that someone had been out here, and recently, and that whoever it was had known exactly what they were doing with a pair of loppers and a saw. Denise looked where her mother pointed, unimpressed at first, the way a person looks at a tree when they've never learned to read one. But even she could see, once her eye adjusted, that the difference was too clean to be accident, too deliberate to be the work of deer or weather or time. She asked her mother who would bother pruning a single tree on 5 acres nobody claimed, and Eleanor admitted she didn't know, though the not knowing sat differently in her now than the grief had sat 2 weeks earlier in a hospital hallway. This was a question with an answer somewhere, she was certain of that much. And answers had a way of surfacing once a person started looking for them with intention, instead of drifting through a life arranged by other people's decisions. The cold was beginning to work into Eleanor's hip by then, and Denise reminded her, not unkindly, that she'd promised the truck back to a co-worker by 3 o'clock. Eleanor nodded and let herself be steered back toward the Silverado, but she paused once more at the gate, hand resting on the cold chain link, and looked back at the pruned tree standing alone in the low afternoon light. Whatever waited beyond that fence, in the collapsed shed and the tangled rows and the ground her mother had walked with a knotted clothesline 80 years before. It was not, she understood now, as abandoned as everyone had assumed. Someone had been keeping a kind of faith with this place quietly, without asking permission or expecting thanks, and Eleanor meant to find out who. Eleanor did not return to the orchard for another 9 days, and those 9 days passed slower than any she could remember since the fall itself. She arranged for a proper ride this time, paying a retired handyman named Dale Kessler $40 to drive her out on a Monday morning and wait as long as she needed, since Denise had made it plain she couldn't spare another Saturday so soon. Dale asked no questions about why a woman on a cane wanted dropped at a gated field off County Road 12, and Eleanor found she appreciated that more than she expected to. He parked the same spot Denise had, cut the engine, and told her to take whatever time she needed. The gate's new padlock defeated her for a full 5 minutes before she remembered the second key on Fenton's copied ring, a small brass one she'd assumed belonged to some long-lost mailbox. It turned with a stiff, grinding reluctance, and the chain slid free with a sound like something exhaling after a long-held breath. Eleanor pushed the gate open against a season's worth of dead grass grown up through its bottom rail, and walked into the orchard proper for the first time since childhood. Her cane finding the same uneven ground her feet had once crossed 100 times without thinking about it at all. The collapsed tool shed sat roughly where memory told her it should, though memory had not prepared her for how far it had sunk into itself. Half the tin roof had folded inward under some winter's snow load, and the door hung crooked on one remaining hinge, swollen shut with damp and rust until it looked less like an entrance than a wall someone had forgotten to finish tearing down. Eleanor tried the handle first, out of habit rather than hope, and it gave nothing. She circled the small building once, cane sinking into soft ground, until she found a length of rusted pry bar leaning against the shed's back wall, half buried in leaf litter, as though someone had used it recently and simply set it down. It took her 3 tries to wedge the flat end of the bar into the gap between door and frame, and a 4th try, braced with her whole weight against the handle before the swollen wood finally gave with a crack that startled a pair of crows out of the nearest tree. The door swung inward on its ruined hinge, and a smell of old motor oil and dust rolled out to meet her, Underneath it, something sweeter and more familiar, sawdust gone soft with decades of damp. Eleanor stood in the doorway a long moment before stepping inside, letting her eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the gap in the roof above. Her mother's tools hung exactly where memory placed them, wrapped in oilcloth that had gone stiff and dark, but had done its work regardless. A grafting knife, a pair of pruning loppers with wooden handles worn smooth as riverstone, a handsaw with half its teeth still sharp beneath a skin of surface rust. Eleanor lifted the loppers first, turning them over in her hands, feeling the same weight and balance she remembered from a girl's grip 50 years earlier, and for a moment the ache in her chest had nothing to do with her hip at all. She set them down carefully on the workbench and kept looking, drawn toward the far corner where a low workbench sat bolted into the shed's dirt floor. It was the bench that held her attention longest, not for what sat on top of it, which was little more than a scattering of rusted nails and a cracked mason jar, but for a seam along its underside that caught the light wrong. Eleanor knelt as best her hip allowed, bracing one hand against the bench leg, and ran her fingers along a board that did not sit flush the way its neighbors did. It moved half an inch under her touch, then stuck, and she worked the pry bar's flat edge into the gap the way she had at the door, levering gently until the board came loose all at once and nearly struck her in the chin. Behind it, set into a shallow cavity someone had carved from the bench's frame, sat a rusted tin box roughly the size of a bread loaf, its surface pitted, but its shape unmistakable as the coffee tin's smaller cousin. Eleanor drew it out with both hands, surprised at its weight, and carried it to a patch of thin winter light near the doorway before she let herself sit down on an overturned bucket to examine it properly. The lid had rusted at its seam, and for a moment she thought she would need the pry bar again, until a firm push of her thumb along one edge produced a soft click, metal giving way to metal after decades of stillness, and the lid lifted free. Inside lay a folded piece of oilcloth, and beneath that a small collection of items that told Eleanor, before she'd even sorted through them, that this box had been packed with intention rather than left behind by accident. There was a rubber-banded stack of receipts from the Marrow Falls feed store, the earliest dated 1953, each one recording a sale of apples for a sum in the range of $9 to $11. There was a photograph, brittle at its corners, of a young Ruth Anders standing beside a much smaller version of the pruned tree Eleanor had seen from the gate, one hand resting on its trunk, the way a person rests a hand on a child's shoulder. Before Eleanor got much further into the tin, it's worth pausing here to say that if this kind of story finds something in you, the kind of quiet history that waits patiently to be uncovered, subscribing helps more of these stories reach the people who need them. Underneath the photograph and the receipts sat a single folded sheet of paper, its creases gone soft with age, and Eleanor recognized her mother's handwriting on it before she'd even unfolded it all the way. It was not the long letter, not yet. Only a short note dated the same spring as the photograph, listing a handful of names Eleanor didn't recognize alongside small sums of money. $5 here, $11 there, with the word paid written beside some and nothing beside others. She sat with the tin open in her lap for a long while, the cold seeping up through the bucket beneath her, trying to understand what kind of ledger her mother had been keeping in secret, tucked behind a false board in a shed nobody was supposed to remember existed. Dale eventually knocked on the truck horn twice, a gentle signal that the hour they'd agreed on had come and gone, and Eleanor gathered the tin and its contents back into the oilcloth with careful hands before making her way out of the shed. She paused at the doorway to look once more at the pruned tree standing green and deliberate among its neglected neighbors, the same tree in the old photograph, tended once by her mother, and, it seemed, tended still by someone else entirely. Whoever that someone was, they had left the shed unlocked, and the pry bar leaning where a searching hand could find it, and Eleanor could not decide, walking back toward Dale's idling truck, whether that felt like carelessness or an invitation. Eleanor came back to the orchard the following Thursday, this time asking Dale to drop her and return in 2 hours instead of waiting in the truck, since she'd decided the cold bothered her less than his idling engine did. She spent the first hour simply walking the rows with her cane, noting which trees might still be saved with proper pruning, and which had gone too far into rot to bother, a survey she conducted out of old habit more than any plan. It was during that hour, crouched near the base of a wine sap, trying to judge the health of its bark, that she heard an engine on the lane behind her, slow and careful over the ruts, and turned to see a faded green pickup easing to a stop outside the gate. The man who climbed out was somewhere in his 60s, built solid through the shoulders in the way of someone who had spent a working life outdoors, wearing a canvas coat patched at one elbow with a square of denim. He carried a pair of loppers in one hand, the same worn, wooden-handled style Eleanor had found in the shed, and he stopped short at the sight of her standing among the trees, clearly having expected the orchard empty the way it had been for years. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Eleanor set down her cane against a trunk and waited, and the man finally raised a hand in something between a wave and an apology, saying only that he hadn't figured on finding anyone out here today. He introduced himself as Walt Correll, from the property 2 farms over, and admitted, without much prompting, that he was the one who'd been pruning the trees. He'd known Ruth Anders as a boy, he said, back when his own father ran cattle on the land next door, and Ruth would send apples over every fall in exchange for nothing anyone ever asked her to pay. When Ruth passed and the orchard started going wild, Walt had taken it on himself, first out of respect and later out of what he called plain stubbornness, to keep at least 1 or 2 trees alive so the whole thing wouldn't die out from neglect while nobody was watching. He'd been doing it, on and off, for the better part of 30 years, never telling anyone in the family because nobody in the family had ever come around to ask. Eleanor found she had to sit down on the overturned bucket she'd left near the shed, not from any weakness in her hip, but from the plain weight of what Walt had just told her, without any drama in his voice at all. She asked him why he'd bothered, 30 years of quiet, unpaid labor on land that wasn't his, and Walt shrugged in a way that suggested the question didn't quite make sense to him. Ruth had helped his family through a hard winter once, he said, back in 1961, when a barn fire took half their herd and nobody expected them to make it through to spring. He didn't say more than that. He didn't need to. Walt walked the rows with her after that, pointing out which trees still had enough live wood to save with hard pruning, and which needed cutting to the ground and starting over from rootstock. He moved through the orchard the way Ruth once had, Eleanor noticed, without wasted motion, reading each tree's shape before he touched it, and she found herself falling into old rhythms just watching him work, calling out the names of varieties before he confirmed them. When they reached the pruned tree she'd first spotted from the gate, Walt ran a hand along its trunk the same way the young Ruth had in the old photograph, and said it was the last of the original 12 still bearing anything worth calling fruit. Before she left that afternoon, Eleanor tried to press 2 $20 bills into Walt's hand, folded together, and offered without much ceremony, a gesture she hoped would settle some part of a debt she felt she now owed him. Walt looked at the money for a moment, then closed her fingers back over it gently, the way a person redirects a child's hand from something not meant for them. He said he hadn't done any of it for payment and wasn't about to start now, and that if she wanted to thank him properly, she could let him keep coming around to check on the trees whether the orchard belonged to her or to anyone else. Eleanor put the money back in her coat pocket, understanding that the offer had been the whole of the transaction, and that refusing it further would only insult a kindness that had already survived 30 years without needing acknowledgement. He didn't say yes and he didn't say no when Eleanor asked whether he'd teach her the grafting technique again, since her hands hadn't held a knife that way since she was a girl. He simply told her to come back Saturday if the weather held, and to bring gloves, because his spare pair wouldn't fit hands as small as hers. Eleanor said she still had her mother's gloves, worn soft as cloth, tucked in a box she hadn't opened in years, and something in Walt's face shifted at that. A flicker of recognition that told her he understood exactly what those gloves meant without her needing to explain further. Before he climbed back into his truck, Walt mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Ruth had kept records of who she'd helped over the years, though he couldn't say what became of them after she passed. He'd always assumed she wrote things down somewhere, being the kind of woman who believed a kindness ought to be remembered even if it was never repaid. Eleanor thought of the short ledger she'd found in the tin, the list of names and small sums with paid written beside some and nothing beside others, and understood suddenly that she was looking at only a fragment of something far larger than a single page could hold. Dale's truck horn sounded from the lane right as Walt pulled his own truck around to head home, and the two vehicles passed each other slowly at the narrow bend by the sycamores, each driver lifting 2 fingers off the wheel in the unhurried greeting of men who'd shared a road all their lives. Eleanor climbed into Dale's truck with the tin still wrapped in oilcloth on her lap, and told him, when he asked how her afternoon had gone, that she'd met a man who'd been keeping a promise to a dead woman for 30 years without once mentioning it to a soul. Dale said that sounded like the kind of person worth knowing, and Eleanor agreed, watching the orchard shrink in the side mirror as the truck bumped back toward the gravel, and beyond it, the smooth gray certainty of Route 9. Saturday came clear and cold, and Eleanor arrived at the orchard with her mother's gloves finally worn on her own hands again, the leather stiff at first before it began to soften with movement, the way old leather always did. Walt was already there when Dale dropped her off, kneeling beside a young Rome beauty with his loppers open, and he nodded a greeting without pausing his work, the way men do who measure friendship in shared labor rather than conversation. He handed her a second pair of loppers from his truck bed, smaller than his own, and told her to start on the low suckers growing up from the base of the nearest tree while he tackled the dead wood higher up. They worked through the morning in a comfortable rhythm, Eleanor's hands remembering more than she expected them to, muscle memory surfacing from 50 years earlier the way it does when a body returns to a task it once knew well. Walt talked more than he had on their first meeting, telling her about the winter of 1961 almost in passing, how Ruth had shown up at his family's door with a truck bed full of hay and a jar of cash she never asked to have counted or returned. He mentioned, too, that Ruth had done the same for at least 2 other families he could name, though he admitted there were likely more he'd never heard about, since she wasn't the kind of woman who advertised what she'd done. It was Walt who noticed the well house first, a squat stone structure behind a curtain of dead blackberry canes near the orchard's eastern boundary, its wooden cap long since rotted through in one corner. He mentioned it only because the ground around its base had settled unevenly, a shallow depression running along one side that looked, to a man who'd spent his life reading land, like something other than ordinary erosion. Eleanor limped over to look, cane sinking in the softer soil, and Walt crouched to press a flat hand against the depression, saying it reminded him of ground that had been dug once and filled back in without much care taken to pack it down again. They didn't dig that day, since Eleanor's hip had already taken more punishment than her doctor would have approved of, but she asked Walt if he'd help her look properly the following week, and he agreed without hesitation. The week between felt longer than the 9 days she'd waited before her first visit, and Eleanor spent much of it back at the pharmacy apartment, reading through the short ledger from the tin box, trying to match names to faces she barely remembered from a childhood spent mostly at the orchard rather than in town. Several names meant nothing to her at all. One, a Pruitt, rang a distant bell she couldn't quite place, though she set the thought aside rather than chase it before she had more to go on. The following Saturday, Walt arrived with a spade and a narrower hand trowel, and the 2 of them worked the depression near the well house slowly, Eleanor directing more than digging, since her hip wouldn't allow much bending. It took the better part of an hour before Walt's spade struck something that gave back a duller sound than stone or root, a flat resistance that made him stop and kneel to clear the soil away with his hands instead. What emerged, inch by careful inch, was a metal ammunition box painted olive drab. Its latch rusted shut, but its seams tight enough that the dirt inside had stayed dry across whatever years it had spent buried there. Walt carried the box to the shed and set it on the workbench, and it was Eleanor who worked the latch open this time, using the same pry bar that had opened the door and the loose board before it, though the latch gave more easily than either had, a soft grinding pop rather than a click. Inside, wrapped in wax paper that had held up better than the oilcloth had, sat a stack of United States savings bonds, older denominations, $25 and $50 apiece. Enough of them that Eleanor lost count somewhere past 30 before setting them aside to keep looking. Beneath the bonds lay a small bank book from a Marrow Falls institution that had closed its doors sometime in the 1990s, its final recorded balance reading $2,200 untouched since a deposit made in March of 1988. The same month Ruth had died. At the very bottom of the box, wrapped separately in the same wax paper, Eleanor found a ledger far thicker than the single sheet she'd already read. Its pages filled front and back in her mother's steady hand, spanning dates from 1952 through the final weeks of 1988. It was not, she realized within a few pages, a record of household expenses or orchard sales. It was a record of loans, dozens of them, made to families across 3 counties, sums ranging from $9 to as much as $400. Most marked paid in full over months or years, a few marked forgiven in Ruth's own hand beside a short note explaining why. Walt read over her shoulder without asking permission. And when Eleanor reached a page listing a loan of $115 to a family named Correll in the winter of 1961, he went quiet in a way that told her the number matched something he'd carried in his memory without ever having seen it written down. He said his father had always spoken of Ruth's kindness as something given freely. No strings, no ledger. And seeing his own family's name recorded there, small and precise, seemed to unsettle him more than any amount of money could have. Eleanor understood the feeling well enough, since she was discovering the same thing about her own mother one page at a time. A woman who had quietly rebuilt half the county's fortunes while raising a daughter who never once suspected the scale of it. They sat together in the shed as the light thinned toward evening, neither of them in a hurry to close the ledger, reading names aloud sometimes and letting them sit in silence other times, depending on what the page seemed to ask of them. Eleanor understood, somewhere in that hour, that the bonds and the bank book, worth perhaps $8,000 or $9,000 combined by any honest accounting, were not really the inheritance her mother had left buried by the well house. The ledger was the inheritance, a record of a life spent giving quietly and expecting nothing back. And Eleanor closed its cover at last with the careful reverence of a woman handling something far more valuable than money. Uncertain yet what she was meant to do with the weight of it, only certain that she could not simply put it back in the ground and walk away. Eleanor did not read the unfinished letter from the coffee tin until 3 days after the ammunition box came up out of the ground by the well house, because some part of her understood, without needing to articulate it, that the two discoveries belonged to different kinds of grief, and she could not hold both at once. She waited instead until she was back in the small rented room above the pharmacy, on a quiet evening with nothing scheduled and no one due to visit, and she set the coffee tin on the kitchen table the way her mother must have set it there herself, decades earlier. The letter had sat folded inside since March of 1988, and Eleanor had read only its first line once before, in the raw days after the funeral, before folding it away and telling herself there would be time later. She made tea first, out of habit more than desire, and sat with the cup cooling untouched beside her, while she unfolded the pages under the kitchen lamp. The paper had yellowed at its edges, but the ink had held, Ruth's handwriting steady through most of it, small and forward-leaning the way it had always been on every ledger page and feed store receipt Eleanor had handled that week. The letter was dated the 2nd of March, 1988, 11 days before Ruth was found in her kitchen chair with the grafting knife still in her lap. And Eleanor understood, reading the date, that her mother had known something the rest of the family hadn't, or had simply felt the need, as some people do near the end, to put certain things down before time ran out to say them. "Dear Eleanor," the letter began, "I expect by the time you read this properly, rather than skimming it the way I suspect you did once already, some years will have passed and the orchard will look worse than I'd like. I'm writing this at the kitchen table with your father asleep in the next room. And I want to tell you a few things I never found the right moment to say out loud. Because saying things out loud always felt to me like asking for more credit than the doing deserved. You will have found the tin by now, and the shed. And I expect eventually the box by the well house too, if the ground hasn't shifted too much to hide it from you. I bought that orchard with egg money, because Silas Meeker's asking price of $211 was the only thing in this county I could afford entirely on my own. And I wanted one thing, just one, that belonged to me, and not to a marriage or a farm or anybody's name but my maiden one. I did not expect it to become what it became. I only meant to grow apples and maybe make enough at the feed store to buy you a good coat some winter. But apples sell for 9 cents a pound, and 9 cents a pound adds up slower than most people think. And somewhere along the way I noticed that a lot of families around here were shorter on cash than they ever let on, especially after a bad frost or a barn fire or a husband gone too long without work. So I started lending what I could spare, a few dollars here, sometimes more. And I kept it separate from the household because your father never had the patience for that kind of risk. And because a woman's own money, I found, goes further when nobody else feels entitled to an opinion about it. I want you to understand I never did it to be thanked. I did it because I remembered what it felt like, as a girl during the hard years, to watch my own mother count coins on a table and come up short. And because it seemed to me a small enough thing, in a life mostly spent doing small things, to make sure fewer people in Marrow Falls had to feel that particular kind of short. The ledger will tell you who and how much, though I expect some of those families have moved on or passed on themselves by the time you're reading this. I forgave what I could afford to forgive and collected what I needed collected, and I never once regretted a dollar of either kind. What I regret, if I regret anything, is not telling you sooner what the orchard really was. Not just apples and rows and a place to escape your father's moods, but a kind of promise I made to myself the day I signed that deed. That I would use what little I had to make sure somebody else's hard year came out a little softer than it might have otherwise. I want the orchard to keep doing that after I'm gone, Eleanor. Whether that means you keep the trees yourself or find someone who will love them the way I did, or whether it simply means you remember, when you're able, that kindness given quietly costs the giver more than kindness given loudly and is worth more for exactly that reason. If Walt Carell's boy is still living nearby when you read this, tell him his family's debt was marked paid a long time ago and always was more gift than loan. Tell anyone else whose name you find in that ledger the same thing, if you're able to find them, though I know that may not always be possible after enough years have passed. I am tired tonight in a way I don't think sleep will fix, and I find I want to stop writing before this letter turns into something more sentimental than I intend it to be. I loved you the way I loved those trees, Eleanor, by showing up every day whether the season was kind or not, and I trust that showing up was worth more to you than anything I might have said instead. Keep the gloves, keep the knife sharp, and if the orchard ever falls into hands that don't understand what it's for, I hope you'll be the one standing there to remind them. All my love, your mother. Ruth Evelyn Anders, 2nd of March, 1988. Eleanor set the letter down flat on the table when she finished it, smoothing one corner that had curled slightly, and sat for a long while without moving, the tea gone fully cold beside her untouched hand. She did not cry the way a scene like this might have called for in a different kind of story. She simply reached over after a time and pressed one worn leather glove to her chest with both hands, holding it there the way a person holds something warm on a cold night, and let herself sit in the quiet the letter had left behind. Outside the window, Marrow Falls had gone dark and still for the evening, and Eleanor stayed at the table a long while longer, the letter open before her, before she finally rose, folded the pages back along their old creases, and carried the coffee tin to a shelf where she could see it every morning from then on. Word of Eleanor's visits to the orchard traveled faster through Marrow Falls than she expected, the way most things did in a town small enough that the feed store and the pharmacy counter still passed along more news than the local paper did. It reached a land developer named Denny Shackelford within a month, a man who had spent the better part of a decade buying up marginal acreage along County Road 12 and Route 9 for a planned expansion of storage units and a truck stop he called, without apparent irony, a travel center. Denny had tried twice before to buy the 5-acre parcel from the estate, back when it was still tangled up in the sale of the main farm, and had been told both times that nobody in the family knew quite who owned it or how to sell something that didn't appear on any current deed. He showed up at the orchard gate on a Wednesday afternoon in early April, driving a clean white pickup with a magnetic sign on the door reading Shackelford Land and Development, and found Eleanor and Walt working near the well house, filling the depression back in now that the ammunition box had given up what it held. Denny introduced himself with an easy smile and a handshake offered to Eleanor first, the kind of practiced warmth that had likely closed a great many deals across a great many kitchen tables. He said he understood the parcel had finally sorted itself out under her name, and that he'd be glad to make things simple for her with a fair cash offer, seeing as an elderly woman probably had better uses for her time than fighting brush and repairing sheds. Eleanor let him talk without interrupting, the way her mother might have, and when he finally named his figure, $18,000 for the full 5 acres, she said only that she'd need time to think it over. Denny's smile held, but something behind his eyes tightened slightly, and he mentioned, almost as an aside, that the county had recently reassessed several parcels along County Road 12 for back taxes going back further than anyone had bothered to check, and that a property with as complicated a paper trail as this one might find itself owing more than it was worth if the wrong office started asking questions. He said it lightly, the way a man delivers a threat dressed up as helpful information, and Walt, standing a few feet off with a shovel still in his hand, went very quiet in a way Eleanor was starting to recognize as his version of anger. Denny left his card and drove off without pressing further that day. But the visit set something moving that Eleanor could feel even before the county's letter arrived 12 days later. It came by certified mail, informing her that an audit of parcel 4471-B had uncovered a discrepancy in filed acreage dating back to a 1962 survey correction, and that until the matter was resolved, the parcel's tax status would be considered under review, which in practical terms meant she could neither sell it nor safely improve it without risking a lien. Eleanor recognized Denny's fingerprints on the timing even if she couldn't prove his hand in it, and she spent an uncomfortable week driving between the recorder's office and a lawyer's office in the next town over. A young attorney named Priya Nair who agreed to take the matter for a flat fee of $400 after hearing the whole story in one sitting. Priya worked quickly once she had the old deed and the county's letter in hand, tracking down the original 1962 survey correction and proving within 2 weeks that the discrepancy was a clerical error involving a neighboring parcel entirely, one that had nothing to do with Ruth's 5 acres at all. The review was lifted by early May, and Priya suggested, gently, that Eleanor consider recording the parcel properly under her own name once and for all, closing off any future confusion that a man like Denny Shackelford might try to exploit again. Eleanor agreed, and paid Priya's fee from the bank book's contents, feeling a small private satisfaction in using her mother's quiet money to defend her mother's quiet land. It was during that same stretch of legal wrangling, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, that a young man named Cody Pruitt appeared at the door of Eleanor's rented room above the pharmacy, having tracked her down through a mention in the county records office of who to ask about the old Anders orchard. Cody was perhaps 22, thin in the way of someone who hadn't eaten regularly in some time, and he stood in the hallway turning a folded piece of paper over in his hands before he finally explained that his grandmother's maiden name had been Pruitt, and that he'd found her name once in an old story his mother used to tell about a woman who'd helped the family through hard times decades back. He'd come, he admitted, mostly out of curiosity, though he didn't hide the fact that he was between jobs and had nowhere steady to stay since his lease ran out at the end of the month. Eleanor recognized the name Pruitt immediately from the ledger's pages, a loan of $60 made in 1964 and marked forgiven in her mother's own hand, with a short note reading, "New, baby, hard winter." She invited Cody in out of the rain, made him a cup of coffee, and told him more than she'd told almost anyone else about the orchard, the tin, and the debt her mother had quietly settled with his family 6 decades earlier. Something in the young man's face shifted as he listened, the particular unguarded surprise of a person hearing, for the first time, that they belonged to a story larger than their own hard luck. And Eleanor found herself thinking of Walt's face on the day he'd read his own family's name in that same ledger. She didn't hand Cody money that afternoon, not directly, but she mentioned that the orchard needed a hand for the summer season, someone willing to learn pruning and grafting from a man named Walt Correll, who lived 2 farms over and had more patience for teaching than he let on. Cody said he didn't know the first thing about orchards, and Eleanor told him that was fine since nobody had known the first thing about them once, including her mother and including herself. He didn't say yes outright, not that afternoon, but he took down Walt's number on the back of the folded paper he'd been carrying, and Eleanor watched him leave with the particular quiet hope of a woman who suspected, without yet being certain, that she was about to watch a very old kindness begin circling back around to complete itself. Cody Pruitt called Walt Correll 2 days after leaving Eleanor's rented room, and by the middle of May, he was showing up at the orchard 3 mornings a week, learning to read a tree's shape the same slow way Eleanor once had, one ruined graft at a time. Walt taught him without much patience for shortcuts, correcting his grip on the loppers, making him practice the same cut a dozen times on deadwood before trusting him near a living limb. And Eleanor watched the 2 of them from the shed doorway some mornings with a feeling she hadn't expected to feel again this late in her life, something close to purpose. Word of the arrangement spread through Marrow Falls the way most things did, carried across feed store counters and church parking lots, until it reached ears Eleanor hadn't anticipated it reaching at all. It was Priya Nair who suggested, once the tax matter had settled and the deed sat recorded cleanly under Eleanor's own name, that the ledger's other names might be worth tracking down properly rather than left as a private curiosity. Eleanor resisted the idea at first, uncertain whether digging up 60-year-old debts, even forgiven ones, was a kindness or an intrusion on people who might not remember or want remembering. But Walt pushed gently in the same direction, saying that his own family had carried Ruth's help as a private blessing for decades, and that other families deserved the chance to know the same thing, if they wanted it. Eleanor finally agreed to a modest notice placed in the Marrow Falls paper, asking whether anyone recognized their family name from an old set of loan records connected to Ruth Anders, with no further explanation offered beyond an invitation to call. The response surprised her more than anything the orchard itself had produced. 11 families called or wrote within 3 weeks, some with names Eleanor recognized from the ledger, and some connected by marriage to names that were their children and grandchildren, scattered as far as 2 states away, but still curious enough to follow up on a notice that mentioned a debt long since forgiven. A gathering assembled itself, almost without anyone formally organizing it, word passing family to family, until a date settled on the second Saturday of June, when nearly 40 people arrived at the orchard gate carrying folding chairs and covered dishes, the kind of turnout Merrow Falls hadn't seen for anything short of a funeral or a wedding in years. Denny Shackelford heard about the gathering the way he heard about most things in town, and he drove out that Saturday afternoon uninvited, parking his white pickup along the gravel shoulder and walking up to the assembled crowd with the same easy smile he'd offered Eleanor months earlier. He found, standing among the folding chairs and covered dishes, at least 6 people whose families his own reassessment scheme had indirectly threatened to cost their inheritance. And he found Walt Carell watching him with an expression that needed no further translation. Denny stayed only long enough to say, quietly, to Eleanor alone, that he understood the parcel wasn't for sale and didn't intend to trouble her about it again, before getting back into his truck and driving off down the dirt lane without the gravel, crunching quite as confidently under his tires as it had on his first visit. The gathering itself stretched into early evening, people trading stories about Ruth Anders that Eleanor had never heard, small kindnesses that had nothing to do with money at all, a delivered casserole during a sickness, a borrowed truck during a harvest, threads of the same quiet pattern running through decades she'd only glimpsed through a ledger's careful handwriting. Cody stood near the pruned tree for most of the afternoon, listening more than talking, and when an older woman approached him to say she'd known his grandmother and remembered the story of a $60 debt forgiven during a hard winter, he pressed a hand flat against his own chest for a moment before answering her, the way a person steadies something that's threatening to come loose. By the time the last of the folding chairs were carried back to trucks and the light had gone long and gold across the rows, Eleanor understood that the orchard had already answered the only question that mattered, the one about what her mother's name should stand for going forward. She asked Walt, as they stood together near the well house watching the crowd thin toward the gate, whether he thought Ruth would have wanted a gathering like this, all that quiet giving suddenly made loud and public after so many decades of deliberate silence. Walt considered the question longer than he usually considered anything, then said he suspected Ruth wouldn't have asked for it, but wouldn't have minded it either, since the trees didn't much care who was watching, as long as somebody kept showing up to prune them. 3 weeks later, in early July, Cody moved into a small trailer Walt helped him park on the orchard's edge, close enough to tend the trees daily without the long drive each morning, an arrangement Eleanor offered without being asked, and Cody accepted without much argument. He was learning to graft properly by then, his cuts still rougher than Walt's but improving steadily, and Eleanor found herself once again teaching a young person the exact motion her mother had once taught her, the knife angle, the patience, the willingness to ruin 3 or 4 attempts before one finally took hold. It felt less like closing a circle than continuing one that had never actually stopped, only paused for a generation while nobody was paying close enough attention to notice it was still turning. On an evening in late September, with the first real chill of autumn settling over County Road 12, Eleanor sat on an overturned bucket near the well house, watching Cody and Walt finish the day's pruning by the last of the light, the same amber slant that had once fallen across a young Ruth Anders standing beside a sapling barely taller than her knee. Somewhere down the lane, a dog barked once at an unfamiliar sound, and a moment later a battered sedan eased to a stop outside the gate, a young woman stepping out uncertainly to ask whether this was the Anders place, since someone in town had mentioned there might be work here for a person willing to learn. Eleanor rose from the bucket, Kane finding steady ground beneath her, and told the young woman to come on through the gate, that there was always room for one more pair of hands willing to show up. She stood a moment longer after the young woman had crossed into the orchard, watching Cody set down his loppers to introduce himself. watching Walt nod the same unhurried greeting he'd once offered her, and felt the evening settle around the 5 acres the way it must have settled countless times before, undisturbed by anything more urgent than the sound of tools being cleaned and put away. A kindness kept quietly costs the giver more, and is worth more for exactly that reason. And Eleanor understood now, standing among trees her mother had planted before she was born, that the debt her family owed the world had finally, patiently, come due. The last light went gold along the rows, then gray, then still, and the orchard settled into evening the way it always had, waiting for whoever came next to keep it.